Namaste and welcome to Dr. Ivy Ingram ji. She is an Ayurveda practitioner, yoga practitioner, and now also a Vedic chanting teacher, I think, spreading the wisdom of the Vedas. Thank you so much, Ivy ji, for joining us today.
Thank you, Aparnaji. It's my honor and pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've just come back from yatra covering some very old spiritual places of Bharat, including Kashi and Ayodhya. Could you share your experience visiting these shrines and the kshetras, Ivy?
Absolutely, yes. So, indeed, I had a great, beautiful opportunity to join some friends and colleagues on this yatra. Actually, I did not make it for the entire plan. So I did not make it to Kashi, but I did make it to Ayodhya and several of the other temples and sacred places that were on our agenda. Um, and it was an amazing experience because I have not had that much exposure to temple tradition in so I have been to some small handful, but this for me was a beautiful opportunity to get even more exposure to this tradition. And what really struck me was the passion and devotion that so many of the devotees that are in these how they're bringing this energy in their daily lives. And so getting just to witness many of the other seekers who were visiting these places, small shrines that may not have gone to any big list of must-see temples. But it's so striking to me. It had just there was a fervor and an excitement amongst the devotees who were coming to this shrine, and it really was made an impression on me how strongly this is a living tradition. So the individuals who had made their way to this place on a holy day, um, everyone was dressed in their finest clothing, even, from the most humble to the most um, highly placed people in society. There is a great sense of commonality. Everyone with the same humility and bhakti. Um, so I think also as a Westerner who hasn't had so much exposure to this living tradition, it's easy, I think, to be distracted by the onslaught of sensory input, the visual complexity of the temple itself, uh, various different people, the mass of people and that was there. The noise, the chanting, and outside there was some drumming. Um, it really can make one get, like I say, distracted, meaning you can be caught up in all of these senses that are being stimulated. And I feel lucky that I've had enough time with the teachers who guide me to drop down into a deeper level of perception to the extent that I can, and really feel for the energy of the place, to feel for the energy of um, the many hundreds or thousands of years of devotion that is inhabiting this space. So, like I say, I'm thinking particularly of this one shrine to the divine feminine that we went to, and aside from all of the drama of the space and the sound and the smells, to really be able to just feel this sense of warmth, this sense of like I just felt the heart was really present in that space. And we actually tried to go in
Mhm.
at, let's say it was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Such a crush of people couldn't get in. And
Mhm.
so another location nearby, back a few hours later, and the crowd had dissipated and we could enter, and it felt almost like the breath of the space
Mhm.
able to be more expansive,
Yeah.
and my literal breath was able to be more,
Mhm.
um, and to just feel my own heart in that space. Um, I could go on and on talking about the impressions that this mantra had on me, but that is one particular scenario that really made an impression. I feel very lucky to have been able to go and to have access to this living tradition, to really see and feel it, how it's in the daily fabric of people's lives. That the divine is such a central part of their lives. It felt really impactful to witness that, and I appreciate that every time I get to be in India.
Thank you. That's really lovely. That brings the question of the immediacy of our lives with, us being part of a larger tradition and a continuum, IBG. So even if you see in Ayurveda, yoga, and all our Indian knowledge systems, we are so caught up with what we can get out of these knowledge systems, what we can apply for either commerce or for our careers and for future benefit. So when we come to these temples, there is nothing that is qualifiable that we can take away or quantifiable. It is just a kind of transcendence which cannot be commercialized, or there is no material benefit, so to speak, which is tangible. So do you think that this is one thing that we have to also be aware of in our careers or in the service that we are doing, not to be caught up in the immediacy and the benefits that can be accrued in the here and now, and instead look at a larger picture of where we are in this great tradition?
Mm, absolutely. I think this may be one of the core sources of pain in our current modern life, is this feeling of loss that comes, I think, from not having access to this spiritual core of our own being. So I think for many of us, and for many people in the West, but certainly across the world, as modernization spreads across the globe, I think for many people, they may not name it in this way, but I think many people feel a loss or a lack of meaning or a lack of connection. Um, they may have the clarity that it is a lack of connection with the divine, but they may feel it simply as depression or anxiety or lack of, like I say, a lack of community or connection. So I think, yes, being in a space, literal space like a temple, but also we could say in any space where these traditions are practiced, where it builds, I believe, and I have witnessed or experienced in myself, many of these Indic knowledge system practices build within us a means of accessing that deeper connection, that deeper purpose, that deep meaning. And I think that's one thing that the commercialization or the material focus, so many of our modern lives just misses. So yes, I think that able to recognize the value of connecting with those inner places of worship, there's inner places of intuition and knowing. I think that's what many of these traditional practices or traditional offer us. And if we recognize that offering, it's such a great boon for society, for any society.
There was one doctor, Indian doctor in the US. Last week I was listening to her, and she says, when we go into Indian knowledge system, including Ayurveda, yoga, chanting, many people go into it thinking that they are getting a spiritual awakening or it feeds their spiritual longing. But as soon as it fulfills a social or a personal deficiency, they are satisfied with that and stop the practice.
Ah,
And it's only a very few for whom this has, true spiritual value. Like, someone might come into it like for, an mental health issue. They might think it's spirituality, but as soon as that issue is resolved, that's enough for them.
yeah.
So, in your own journey, what do you, how does one know what one is seeking and keep going forward?
Oh, what a beautiful question. How does one know what one is seeking? I think it's one of those questions that when we recognize the hunger within us that brings us seeking something, uh, I have developed a trust in my own path, but also in witnessing my clients' paths, my colleagues or friends' paths. I've developed a trust that whatever it is that brings us deeper into that exploration has its own wisdom and guidance to it. That ultimately, as I understand it, I see that the divine is guiding that. So it doesn't almost matter, I think, what it is that we get drawn towards. If we recognize, I feel, like you say, if it is a mental health issue, I feel some sense of depression or anger or some other mental health disturbance. And that's the instigation of starting my own seeking. I think that there's a divine unfolding that happens. So I certainly couldn't judge somebody else's path in that sense. Um, and if they come to, let's say, if they come to yoga, I myself came to yoga first as the entry point. I think so many of us Western, or I myself from the United States, we may find a practice like yoga asana is the front door. And so I didn't know what I was seeking. I recognized that the practice itself of asana, the first class that I came to, was more narrow in its scope. And I just recognized that I felt better. Now, if you had pressed me at that time, 20 plus years ago, to name what was it that was feeling better, I might not be a very articulate answer. Yeah, definitely some physical benefits. But I could tell certainly that there was something mental, but not like only the thinking mind, but something more emotional that felt more peaceful, more at ease, more supported when I was in my practice, when I was doing asana or just being in the space of the studio. And that inspired me to go further and just to practice more. And then ultimately, I decided to become a yoga teacher. And then the door opened wider. I learned a lot more about many other levels of yoga, the Ashtanga system of Patanjali. I became aware of all of these other components that maybe I'd had a little taste of here or there, but it just kept unfolding from there. So to your question, I think anytime that someone feels some sense of, I'll say, reward or benefit from one of these practices or exposure to one of these Indian knowledge systems, um, I think we can trust that there's there's a divine energy that is holding and supporting their development. Um, and the more they are exposed, I find, for those who have the readiness, then it deepens, then or the path, unfolds deeper. Um, so yeah, I find that's served, and it doesn't serve, right? These paths, these traditions, these particular practices may not serve everyone. Um, we're in the Kali Yuga, I think it's going to be, probably a relatively small number of people who do take the deeper practices into their really heartfelt way. But I think we all know even the quote lighter practices or smaller practices have great value in and of themselves. And so we'll leave it in God's hands to path.
Absolutely. So, in terms of the Vedic chanting course, I think, like a lot of Indians learn music and chanting from a very young age, and it's almost like it's not something special or extraordinary that they're doing. It's a very daily kind of thing. But when you learn either music or chanting at a later age, it's almost like a gift from the divine because you realize how lucky you are to be given an opportunity and to be able to even pick it up because the odds of being able to deal with the complexity of it is so mind-boggling sometimes. So,
Yes.
in your interview with Sophia, you mentioned that you don't know what you're going to do with it or how it may unfold. So that is a second part to the learning, but just being able to do it in the first place itself is quite extraordinary. So what do you think that chanting, when people say, whenever you do a course, people say, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with learning something like this at this age? So is that a question that should be asked at all with something like chanting?
No. I think the better question and the question that I ask more frequently is, what is this practice going to do with me? How is
Yeah.
it going to affect and change me?
Mm.
And may I allow it to change me in the way that I have the potential to change. Um, yes, I think that again, it's this idea that when we bring our logical mind to address any question, I think we end up shutting out other sources of knowing from within. I know this from personal experience because I have a long tradition in myself of being occupied by my logical, rational mind. Um, and I feel like so many of the practices are really designed to help us move the thinking mind, the manas, to the side so that we can access these other ways of knowing, so that we can receive other guidance that is readily available when we have the tools or the techniques or the practices, and the guru's blessing and, the divine. So yeah, I think at least this has been my intention in finding this opportunity to learn Veda recitation and chanting at this point in my life. I actually was exposed to it about 17 or 18 years ago with a beautiful teacher, but I only got to be with her for about 6 months. Um, and then I moved and was unable to continue my study. So to come back to it, that planted a seed at that time. and then to come back to it, or again, I would say for it to come back to me in this way so many years later, that seed had an opportunity to sprout and grow, and I couldn't have foreseen that. And I couldn't have I can't today foresee how
Hmm.
this sprout will grow, but I have great faith. I have great faith.
Yeah. So which is your I mean this is a very journalistic kind of question. Which is your favorite mantra, or which what do you like to chant the most?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. It's like wild, right? So I could probably say many things, but what comes to mind first is the Shraddha Suktam. And partly this is because of the teaching I have received from my teacher, Shantala Sri Ramayaji, um, that she received from her guru, that Shraddha, this idea of a heartfelt, enthusiastic commitment or inspiration, but there's an urgency to it, an urgency to learn, to be present with these teachings, um, that this is the bedrock of our practice. Uh, so we chant the Shraddha Suktam to cultivate that quality within. I think for many of us who are drawn to study any of these Indian knowledge systems, that Shraddha is strong already. That's what brings us, for those of us from the West, that's what brings us to perhaps a foreign land or a foreign language or a foreign practice. There is some Shraddha that is vital and alive within us. But then we can cultivate it. We can cultivate it even more with this suktam and with this intention. And that then leads to the development of other qualities that are necessary. We could say Shraddha is necessary as a first step. It maybe is not sufficient to really
Hmm.
cultivate the depth of the practice, but it's a necessary bedrock to then help lead us into developing the other qualities that will strengthen our practice. So that comes to mind right now as
Yeah,
the
that's so beautiful because I heard it being chanted at the Sai Grama institution when our founder Harikiran Vadlamani ji got an award for excellence in education. And I was wondering, if there's an English equivalent for the word Shraddha, and I couldn't find an exact translation into English.
Mm,
So thank you for sharing this sentiment. And
yeah.
with Shraddha, you say, we also need to make a commitment, and we have another word which is sankalpa. And
Mm,
that is, something that we have to commit to uh,
mm,
prior. And, we cannot drop off midway, if in the Indian tradition, because then they say you will be born again to complete it.
ah,
So, how important is sankalpa and this, having this determination to complete what you have started despite all, there will be many challenges along the way. So, what would be your advice be to non-Indians in terms of undertaking something like yoga training or Ayurveda or Vedic chanting?
mm, mm. I also see this in relation to uh, many of my clients that I may work with around their own health. As an Ayurveda practitioner, that's one other piece of my work is supporting clients who are wanting to make changes to support their own well-being, their own physical and mental health. Um, so I think, yes, in the study of any of the knowledge systems, but also in our evolution, uh, in our own health and well-being, I think Sankalpa is it's actually kind of one of the hidden magic tools, like a magic wand, um, not in the sense that as soon as we make a sankalpa, all of the riches of the kingdom is ours, but rather that having a sankalpa, having that strong guiding intention, it allows us to more easily come back when we get off the path. What we typically know is that we will fall off the path at one point or another. To know that means that we don't have to then beat ourselves up. We don't have to criticize ourselves when that happens. But rather, if we have the sankalpa in place, we recognize when we may have gotten off course. And we've already got a vision, a strong guiding intention that we can come back to. So that's the way that I like to think of sankalpa, is taking the time and the devotion and the power of, let's say, visualizing the goal that we're aiming towards. That time spent to cultivate or create and really envision that sankalpa is time well spent, because then if we get misguided along the way, we have that way to course correct and come back to the intention that got us on the path in the first place. So I also think about sankalpa as being something that we create in partnership with our own connection to the divine. So if we are just bringing our thinking mind, our intellect, our small self to the sankalpa, then it may not serve the purpose that we actually want it to serve. And so thinking of sankalpa as actually something that is, we really enlist the divine to support us in that sankalpa. We also recognize the limits of our own visualization, our own imagination of what the future might hold for us. So my sankalpa, I may think, oh, I'm aiming for this goal or this endpoint. But if I enlisted the cooperation of my connection to the divine, then I always hold the possibility that my vision is not actually in alignment with what my divine has for me. It becomes less about my what's the word I want? It becomes more humble. It becomes more humble. I set my intention, but with humility, to recognize that it's all in God's hands and requires the support of the divine to reach the outcome that is meant to be reached. So that's the way I think of sankalpa as an important piece in setting out on the study of one of the vast knowledge systems. I always need the support of the divine to make it end, or what I think is the end goal, and hold the divine knows where my end goal is.
How beautiful. One of the pitfalls of scholarship in Indian knowledge systems in the modern world, because there are very few people who actually dedicate their lives to it, is what you're talking about, is the maybe humility or the lack of humility. As soon as you start getting knowledge, there is always a hidden danger that you feel that this knowledge belongs to you and you own it. But we have the concept of Guru, Rishi, and Pitru Runa. These are debts that we owe to our gurus, the rishis, and our ancestors, and we have to pay it back in some way. So where does one balance this when we are coming from a non-Indian culture? What do these rinas, do they have any bearing on how you relate to the knowledge? Guru, I think, would be a direct connect to the guru is there. What about maybe even the rishis? What about the pitrus, and how do they get connected to this lineage?
Mm. I feel lucky that I have had teachers who have held up the importance of these connections, um, to recognize the debt that I owe to my ancestors, meaning my direct lineage, my blood lineage, but also more widely speaking to the ancestors that have held these particular traditions in a culture that's very different from my birth culture. Um, I feel like this debt uh, is such a vital part of the tradition itself. So again, I can only attribute it to the great teachers that I have had, that it has felt like that concept has been woven in to the teachings themselves that I've been lucky to receive. Um, However, that being said, it's true that I think in my personal experience of my culture in the United States, it is not such a common concept. And it's, I think, easy to miss the importance of that, of paying homage, of paying respect, to the ancestors that have come before. Um, I think there's also maybe a modern, ultimately, let's say it's a positive modern, recognition of some of the pain or trauma that our predecessors may have experienced in individual lives. But I think sometimes that can be overemphasized, such that there's this idea of, like historic trauma or ancestral trauma that I might be needing to live out the repercussions of things that have happened to my ancestors. I think that's true, but I think sometimes that can get overemphasized in this modern day without recognizing the great gifts, the great strengths that our ancestors have held and um, still embody. And maybe that's the wrong word, not embody in the because they aren't embodied at this point, but that we can embody from their guidance. So for me, again, my teachers have held up these traditions, such as the traditions of Pitrabhaksha, how we might make a very literal and tangible recognition of, those who have come before us. And I also think about it as one way to honor or pay back that debt to my ancestors and the rishis, and certainly the gurus, is with their guidance and support to pass forward that teaching. If I'm in a position and if I have been blessed to be a vehicle of that teaching, but to see that as very direct, guru seva, very direct, ways of honoring my ancestors.
So could you just tell us briefly about the ways in which this is done and how you're doing it in the US? How do you, what is the way your work is served? What is your practice about, and how much time do you spend with Ayurveda, yoga, and chanting?
Hmm. Do you mean in terms of the
Your
Pitra?
work. No, just your work, your practice right now.
So how is my practice literally coming into being? Yes, okay. Um, so interestingly, of course, we've all been so impacted by, some of the modern, repercussions of the COVID era. So my practice, I am, as I mentioned, both an Ayurveda practitioner, also a yoga teacher, and more recently a Veda Recitation teacher. So my first foray came into, teaching yoga. And in many ways, it's what you might predict, or expect in teaching group classes, um, in various public settings. However, pretty early on, I also took a particular interest in teaching those who are holding a healing space for others. So I was working in allopathic hospital at the time and started teaching yoga to the nurses and other healthcare providers within that hospital. So that's one way that my physical practice or way in which that I teaching came into being. I also have felt great joy, but also a feeling of paying back the responsibility I owe to those who have taught me in teaching those who have particular challenges around health. So I taught yoga particularly to folks who were healing from cancer. And that class felt like a great healing environment for not only the physical body, but the piece that we were speaking about earlier around this connection with and that wider path of yoga. So that's one way that feels very rich, is coming and offering these teachings to people who recognize their own vulnerability, recognize their own fallibility, humanity, in the sense that we all will die, we all get sick, and being able to use these tools of yoga to help people who are right there in the heart of that confrontation. When I became an Ayurveda practitioner, I began with doing some one-on-one consultations with people in kind of a clinic setting. I also, however, have had great joy from leading some programs with a focus on the digestive process, helping people to go through a digestive reset or detoxification and rejuvenation protocol. And working with the support or the guidance of one of my teachers to create that kind of programming felt like a beautiful way of really speaking to one of the specific difficulties that I see in my culture around digestion. We have very few food traditions. We have very few traditions around healthy digestion, that practices or the simple around mealtime to really support healthy digestion. As COVID came on the scene, I had to really give up my physical in-person practice, and I moved everything I was doing online. And now, 4 years on, I am still all of my practices online. So I moved to more of a group program model and have really found such a great sense of connection and a great result by teaching a group a year-long commitment of women. It's a women's program where they commit to being together for a year to learn about the dinacharya or daily practices, healing routine. And we get into some practices from yoga, including some pranayama or breathing practices, some practices of meditation and spiritual practice or prayer as it fits their particular tradition. And this has been a great model that I'm looking forward to continuing, is a group program that allows us to have the connection and support of community or satsang. Because I feel like this is another that we lack the United States for the most part. Satsang or that sense of shared seeking of the truth, and that group connection as a umbrella within which I do some individual work with the members as well. This has been really fruitful for my clients and feels like a beautiful way of integrating some of these teachings of Ayurveda about daily routines and giving that guidance or support that individuals often need and feel most accountable to when we have the conversation as well. So that's a big piece of my current practice, is in this online setting. So we once a week on a group call, and then we have as well. I also still teach a little bit in person with individual clients, asana and pranayama one-on-one. And I anticipate that will continue, and I really hope it will grow in the years ahead as I get back into a little bit more in opportunities. I miss being in the room with my students and my clients.
How lovely. So even the words that we use, like even in journalism, we call journalists as service providers, or something that. So now people who are not well are clients. So is that something that has, the Vaidya is not called a Vaidya, but he's called a doctor for most practical purposes. So, does do those terms make a difference as to how we see our profession and how those who are getting healed see us?
Mm. I'm sitting with this question because I think so much that gets held in a word, and particularly Sanskrit words.
Yeah.
Um, and I've struggled with this. Not struggled, but I've held and reflected on this as I think about how to articulate what I do and what Ayurveda is about, or what Veda Recitation is about, to an audience who doesn't speak or doesn't have, I mean, plenty of people don't speak Sanskrit, but for people who don't have any exposure or access to this language. Um, so I have found that the words that I use in an introductory context, so if people aren't yet deep in one of the traditions or practices, I often will use simple words in English, such as client, such as student, such as practitioner, to make it immediately accessible to that audience. Also, just one other side note, for myself, I recognize the training that my Vaidya teachers have been through. You know, upwards of 5, 6, 7, 8 years of study in the medical art and science of Ayurveda. And I have not had that level of training and study. So I feel very clear that I am not a Vaidya. And so in using a precise term that, again, in the West, we use that term doctor as equivalent with Vaidya. I don't use that word doctor for myself because the equation of those terms. Um, so I guess to answer your question, I feel like I'm kind of around your question a bit, but I'm wanting to be in my claim of training and credibility that I possess. Um, and then I want to be clear in communicating to the audience that I'm speaking to what it is that we're doing. I also think that maybe speaking to the larger question that you're asking, I think that there's also an invitation when we use the Sanskrit terms. There is a more natural invitation into the wider interpretation or understanding that, for example, Ayurveda offers this more holistic view of a human, that we are integrated being that has both physical components, mental or emotional components, and spiritual components. And you can't pull those apart. That's what a human is. And when we think, oh, medical science, healthcare is about the body, mental health care is about the mind, we create these arbitrary separations. So I think the Sanskrit terminology, and people have to slow down and think a little bit more about, well, what is it that we're talking about now? Like, what is Ayurveda about? And it's a useful, intentional invitation to a deeper inquiry around what is this practice? What is it we're up to here?
Mhm. Just a last question. We thank you so much for all the wonderful responses. One last question. I read somewhere that earlier the test for a graduating Ayurveda practitioner was they would be shown, few plants, um, not easily recognizable, and they had to tell what the benefits of the plants were. And even the Purusha Suktam, says that we know only one fourth of all that there is to know in the universe. So the rest of it has to be intuited. So in your studies with yoga, Ayurveda, and Vedic chanting, do you think that unknown is more accessible because of your study of these three systems?
Mm, mm. Yes, yes, absolutely. I think that intuition is a perhaps a poor English translation of,
Mhm.
or a narrow English translation of this quality that, again, I think all of these practices cultivate within us. It's a deeper way of knowing truth than just memorization of logical or rational points that we might learn. Um, as my Ayurveda teachers have said, we must pay respect and duty to the Ayurveda, to the goddess, the spirit of Ayurveda, by studying in this way. We must
Mm.
do this rational, logical study,
Mm.
um, with a recognition that that helps us cultivate the intuition, the yukti, the access to a deeper way of knowing. Um, Intuition is not just about feeling what's true, or just on a whim having a gut reaction to something. It's really a strong, vigorous, and rigorous practice that cultivates intuition, that cultivates the ability to look at a plant that you've never seen before, and have some means of accessing what are the qualities that it's embodying, what is the sign that it's showing me, um, of what its gift is. So I think these practices themselves, when we go deeper into them, they strengthen that access to other ways of, um, that's the reason why we never get dull and bored. Right?
That's
Like, once
true.
we know we've never made it to the end of our learning, and if we're always cultivating our own ability to see what nature is showing us, we're always developing. I think that's the idea of being a lifelong student or a lifelong devotee, a
Yeah.
lifelong facilitator of healing. Um, that's part of my intention, is to
Yeah.
getting my intuition and ability to see and know from a deeper place.
Yeah. How lovely. I think that jigyasa or curiosity, I mean, to have that every day and a sense of wonder, just to be alive in that fundamental way is such a blessing.
So true, right? It
Yeah.
keeps us fresh. It keeps us
Yeah.
inspired to wake up and to see
Yeah.
what else the world has to show us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ivy. Such a lovely time spent with you. All the very best with everything, and hope to have more conversations like these.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aparnaji. It was such a
Thank
joy to
you.
get time
Yeah.
together. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you soon.
Namaste. See you soon. Bye.
Namaste.